So now we're going to take a look at how to paint eyes, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an eye base layer here, and I'm going to use the mats here to just wand select where the eyes are, and then now in the eye base layer I will just paint this with a yellow ochre color, very pale yellow, and I'll just opaquely fill that in. And then I'll change it to an overlay blending mode. Now that eye base, it's going to be really easy to control click on that layer at any point that I need to select just the eyes, because the pixels that represent the eye area are all painted in there. So if you control click on the layer, it selects only the pixels that are in that layer. So it's a quick way of selecting the eye. So I'm coming in here and I'm just deleting out the noise that's in the eye area. I have the eye pixels selected under those marching ants. So I'm just going through my overlays from before and just deleting out where I feel like some of the noise is actually breaking up the surface of the eye too much and getting distracting. I'm just going through my layers and turning things on and off just to make sure that I'm clear on where everything's actually coming from in terms of what's affecting the color and what's affecting the texture on the head and the eyes right now. That's why it's important to keep all this stuff layered and labeled clearly. So I'm going to create a layer now and call it Iris Base. I'm going to select a brush with a relatively hard edge, a round brush, and I'm going to paint a black circle for the base of the iris. And again, this is just to very clearly delineate where the iris will be, and it'll serve as a guide for us to paint on. And if I control click eye base, look at this. If I control click on eye base, control click, it will select with a marching ants marquee the pixels of the eye area. So when I paint, I won't overspray onto the eyelids. I'm just going to be painting on the eye itself. I have the selection hidden here with Control H. So I basically just Control click on eye base layer. It selects those pixels, and then Control H hides the selection. So it allows me to very easily come in here and then paint the iris shape, not have to worry about whether or not it's going to overspray onto the eyelids. So it just naturally clips that off. Again, remember that's Control click on any layer to select the pixels in that layer. So even though I'm painting on the iris base layer, if I Control click on eye base, it's going to create a marching ant selection for the entire eye. It's creating a new one now called Iris Light. I'm going to soften the edge of my brush and select a white color. And I'm basically just going to gently create a gradient here in the eye where the light would be hitting it. So if the light's coming from the upper left-hand corner of the picture plane, then it's going to hit the brightest down here in the lower right-hand corner of the eye. And it's just creating a sense of depth in there. And this is a separate layer called Iris Light sitting on top of Iris Base. And I'll just erase that out a little bit, just try and finesse that. There's going to be color on top of this, so this is going to create the lightness and darkness values in the eye. So I'm going to create pupil now, and that's very simply a hard dark brush. So I'll use that to paint in a pupil. Now for the pupil, because I want this character to feel really intimidating, I give it a very small pupil. Predators tend to have their irises contract when they're seeking prey, so it's far more intimidating to have a very small pupil on a monster rather than a very large one. That feels more engaging and open if you have an open, dilated eye. So I'm going to select these layers and just scooch them around a little bit with the move just to make sure they're lining up nicely. And it looks good. I'm going to select just the eye, or just the pupils, and try and move these around just so it doesn't feel wall-eyed. Just want to make sure that those pupils are lining up nicely in perspective. And I'm going to create an iris color layer here. Select a orangish, or actually we're going to go to, we're going to stay with an orangish color, and we're going to paint this orange color as an overlay layer on top of our iris color, or iris light. And that's just going to tint the iris and give it a nice orangish hue. These layers are all in the PSD file that I've left available to you. There you see that I control-clicked on the iris base layer, and then very briefly there you saw the marching ant selection before I hit Control-H to hide them. So you see that orange color is not very bright there where the white is the brightest in my iris light, so right now I'm erasing out iris light. I'm just going into the iris light layer and just knocking back the brightness in the lower right-hand corner. Now I'm duplicating that layer and bringing the lightness down and the saturation up. So I'm basically punching up the color of the eyes even more. Just erasing out a little bit. The eyes are looking very flat right now, but we will tie them together very soon. So dialing my brush down to a real fine line on a new layer, I'm just going in here and creating the striations in the iris. You know, those very familiar lines radiating out from the pupil. And this is on the duplicate eye color layer. Creating a new layer again. And here I'm just experimenting with the difference between soft and hard light blending modes just to see if I can get something a little bit punchier for this layer. And I'm leaving it on hard light for now, and just to punch up those striations that we're putting into the iris. Control-click on the eye base layer again, and you'll see that that selects the eye base. And I did iris base, and that selected the iris base. So you're just going to, watch carefully and you'll see those selections happen. It's not anything that I do in the interface. It's entirely based on hotkeys and clicking. Just control-click on the layer and it selects the pixels that are currently in that layer. And here I'm just painting a dark ring around the outside of the iris, and I find that's really important because the iris insets into the surface of the sclera, so we need that shadow there to sort of anchor it in the head. Later we're going to paint a shadow around the entire eyelid where it's making contact with the eyeball for that same reason, but I'm just trying to darken that. There we go. You can see how that really anchors and insets the iris into the eye. And especially over here, if you watch this happen on the farther eye, really brings that down into the head. And it punches up the intensity of the eye as well. It really locks in that color and makes the gaze very piercing and very intense whenever you put that real dark ring in the outside of the iris. And usually the iris is darker around the outside edge, and around the inside edge you'll get different variations of color. And I'm just punching up those striations a bit more, darkening them from the inside as they radiate out. There we go, just again turning down the draw size on the brush, and this time I'm using the eraser just to erase out some of that color, just to add some more variation to the color of the eye. Because I'm not quite comfortable yet with the the eye color at this stage in the painting, so I'm still tinkering with it. Again, I've got two color layers stacked up on top of each other as overlays, and that's how I'm arriving at that vibrant orange. So I'm just erasing out bits of it, adjusting the hue and saturation. And that hue saturation menu, by the way, it's accessible under under the image menu, but I just use Control U to bring that up. Control U brings up hue saturation. And I'm just naming the layers descriptively. I always want to make sure that anytime I've got something that's just a layer number, I try and give it a descriptive name so it's clear what it is. So there's the iris dark ring, for example. That's the dark ring around the iris. It's getting to the point now those eyes feel real flat because they don't have any sort of reflection, any sort of specular reflection on there. So we're getting to the point now where we need to add that in. I believe in just a moment we'll be doing that. I will there we go. Just doing a little bit of erasing out of the shadow there because it's too dark up at the top of the eye. I was feeling like the shadow was getting a little bit too heavy, and I'm not getting enough color around the entire perimeter of the eye there, the one that's closest to us. So we're going to punch that up again just by erasing out some of that that shadow, or brightening by going into my iris light and adding in some white along the upper edge, because remember that was falling off into darkness, and now that gives us a very nice eye. So now we've got a reflection layer. In our reflection layer, we're going to select the color white, round brush, medium hardness, and we're just going to tap, tap, tap with the mouse to ping a little highlight. Turn our draw size down a bit and then do it a second time. There we go. And I always try and make sure that the highlight is crossing over the border between the iris and the pupil. It just feels better to me when I do that. And I add a second one in the lower right hand corner as well. So there'll be two highlights pinging on the eye. Now, while it may not be physically accurate, to the physics of light, it's dramatic and graphically appealing to me to paint the eye reflection this way. I very rarely, actually I would never only put a single reflection in the eye. I would always put two in there, because usually you're going to get two reflections because of the concavity of the, or the convex nature of the iris, or excuse me, the corneal bulge. And now I'm going in and selecting the pupils there of the base, the eye base, and I'm setting my blending mode to overlay and just painting in brown around the corners of the sclera just to make it feel a little bit darker in there, and anchor that into the head a little bit more. Don't want it to be just a pure white pool cue ball of an eyeball. I want this to feel like it's got some color and some hue variation to it, especially as we move around towards the membranes in the corners of the eye. So if I go into my reflection, or I go into my eye layers here and select them all and group them together, and I can just name them eyes. So now we've got a layer group just for our eyes. We can turn those on and off. Always keep your layers organized. It's going to be a lot easier to navigate, and for someone else to navigate your work as well.